Hello, students. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 9, An Emerging World Power. We're going to be discussing the topic of American imperialism and studying the years 1890 to 1917. First of all, a few definitions here. When we say imperialism, we mean the policy by which strong nations extend their control over weaker territories. Another way to say this is creating colonies in other places around the world, much as Great Britain did with the 13 colonies in North America. Now, we refer to the mid 1850s to the early 1900s as the age of imperialism because this was the time period when many countries around the world were establishing colonies in other areas. So, what are the causes of imperialism? We're going to discuss a few. Number one is economics. Within economics, we need to understand what an extractive economy is. Extractive economies are when the home country or the mother country or what have you extracts natural resources, goods, labor, so forth from the colony for use of the home country. Now, the United States wanted colonies for the opposite reason. We mainly wanted new markets to sell in. We had an excess, we had a surplus of goods, products, and so forth within this country. And we wanted new markets. We needed an outlet for those products and those goods and those services. So the reason we wanted colonies, economically speaking, is really opposite from the reasoning, economically speaking, of other countries, specifically European countries. Also, military strength. Countries wanted bases around the world. They wanted naval ports. A man named Alfred T. Mahan wrote a book during this time, and in the book he theorized that in order to have a strong, successful nation, that a country needed a strong navy. He looked at different countries, different empires in the world, and concluded that a common denominator that they all had was a strong navy. And the U.S. really bought into this idea. And by 1900, we had the third largest navy in the world. The third reason is nationalism. During this time period, throughout the world, there was a great fad, or there was a great uprising of nationalistic feeling and fervor, extreme patriotism. And this nationalism led countries to want to spread their culture, their ideas, their beliefs to other places in the belief they had the quote unquote best culture. A term we need to understand here is social Darwinism. If you remember, we discussed this when we discussed the Gilded Age and industrialization in this country. It's the belief that only the fittest countries will survive, and basically that the fittest, best countries will naturally rise to the top. This was the same argument, if you'll remember, that industrialists used to describe why they were becoming millionaires and there were so many in poverty. Some expansionists applied manifest destiny to the Pacific Islands. To review, the term manifest destiny means the belief that it was God's will, or it was meant to be, that the United States should own from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. There are some extreme expansionists that said this should apply to the Pacific Islands as well, and that we should continue to expand westward. So during this time, America became a world power, and we're going to walk through a few steps of why and how that came to happen. Number one was the taking of the Pacific Islands, and you can read the instances there where we took different islands and gained different parts of islands. In 1853, Matthew Perry also convinced Japan to open up her ports, and we began trading and having influence there. William Seward, the Secretary of State during the time of this purchase, paid $7.2 million to Russia to buy what many people called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. They said, why are we buying this huge chunk of land so far away from our continental U.S. for so much money when it is worthless? Now, we know that future has taught us that as we've gone through time, we found many natural resources there, such as coal, oil, gold, etc. It's also a very strategic piece of land for us to own, being so close to Russia and also a presence in the Pacific, the northern Pacific region. We also began to gain influence in Latin America. This is mainly economically when we began trading and investing in Latin America. When they saw that we could make them rich, they began to listen to us a little bit more. We began to dictate what was happening there. The story of Hawaii is very interesting. First of all, since the 1790s, the U.S. had been economically tied to Hawaii. We had planted crops there. We had done trading there. We had done business with them and made a lot of money off of Hawaii. However, as time went on, Hawaii, the indigenous Hawaiians, began to become resentful of this and to not let us do exactly what we wanted to do. So therefore, a group of rebels led by Sanford B. Dole, who was the owner of the Dole Fruit Company, overthrew the queen, Liliuokalani, and the new government was friendlier to his business and allowed him to continue to do what he had been doing in the past. President Cleveland, however, did not agree with the way things went down and refused to annex Hawaii. However, President McKinley, which was more business-minded and more expansionist-minded, finally annexed Hawaii in 1898. This brings us to the Spanish-American War. We're going to walk through the causes of this. Number one, the Cubans began to rebel against Spain. Spain controlled Cuba. Cuba was a colony of Spain during this time, and Americans had invested $50 million in Cuban sugarcane. So when Jose Marti began to lead a rebellion against the Spanish rulers, Jose Marti being an indigenous Cuban, the instability concerned our businessmen who had so much money tied up in Cuba, and they urged our government to become involved. And urging our people to become involved was the newspaper industry. Yellow Press began to inflame opinion. Pulitzer and Hearst, the two biggest newspaper men in the country, the two great competitors, competed with each other to sell newspapers and in the process rallied Americans against the Spanish. Yellow press is a term that we use to describe, by the way, exaggeration about real events. This harkens back to the days when yellow was the primary color used in newspapers when they were printing in other than black ink. William Randolph Hearst also published the Delome letter, which was a letter from Spain's ambassador criticizing the U.S., further fueling war fervor within this nation. And we have the USS Maine incident, in which the USS Maine, which had been sent to Cuba to protect American interests, was sitting in Havana Harbor and exploded. Now, a quick investigation came to the conclusion that a Spanish mine had been planted, and Spain had been the culprits here and had contributed to and caused the sinking of the USS Maine. Yellow Press, without much evidence, began to blame Spain without getting all of the facts. It has since been determined it was probably an explosion in the boiler room. And after all of this, Congress declared war after McKinley's hastily conducted investigation. But before this could happen, the Teller Amendment was passed, which said that in an event of war, if we were to gain Cuba from Spain, we would not annex it. This, of course, was put in there by the anti-expansionists, the ones that did not think it was right for us to annex Cuba. And on April 19, 1898, with the Teller Amendment being added, Congress declared war. The greatest naval hero of this war was George Dewey. He defeated the Spanish in the Philippines. The Philippines were held by Cuba at the time, and it was a very, very decisive victory, essentially destroying the entire Spanish fleet in a single battle. Emilio Aguinaldo was a Filipino nationalist. He was the peer of Jose Marti. Jose Marti led the rebellion in Cuba. Emilio Aguinaldo led the rebellion in the Philippines. The Rough Riders were a very, very adventurous, very boisterous group of soldiers that fought with Teddy Roosevelt in this war. They were made up of college athletes, cowboys, and miners. They were led by Teddy Roosevelt, and the charge up San Juan Hill was their most famous victory, this being the battle, by the way, that earned Teddy Roosevelt the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, we will cover the effects of the war in the next section.